Y'all know how much I love George Washington. Well, today we're digging into his farewell address. Welcome to another episode of the Practical Patriot. I'm so glad you guys are joining me. Today we are going to dig into George Washington's farewell address, which he gave on September 19th, 1796. And it is fantastic. As we all know, George Washington was very wise and knew what would happen in America, and it is happening. So we're going to start here a little ways in. At the beginning of his message, he talked about his own personal thoughts on being the president and retiring after his 8 years. So I'm going to start right here. He's talking about how he wants to share some sentiments with the people regarding how he views what can happen in America. These will be offered to you with the more freedom as you can only see in them by the disinterested warnings of a parting friend who can possibly have no personal motive to bias his counsel. Nor can I forget, as an encouragement to it, your indulgent reception of my sentiments on a former and not dissimilar occasion. Interwoven as is the love of liberty with every ligament of your hearts, no recommendation of mine is necessary to fortify or confirm the attachment. Don't you just love that? Talking about liberty. The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support for your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, although often covertly and insidiously, directed. It is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and your individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it. Isn't this just wonderful? Accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which are now linked together the various parts. I think that's just so important. Discountenancing, I know that's a funny word, but that's what it says. Discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can be in any event abandoned, which they're not trying to do currently, but they are trying to erode the Constitution away. I was just posting something today regarding a bill, a joint resolution, which has been proposed by a Democrat in Congress to a bunch of them in Congress to get rid of the Electoral College. They want to get rid of it, which we all knew was coming. We all knew that they would try and get it taken away, but let them try. They still have to have 2/3 of the states to agree with the constitutional amendment, and that is not going to happen with the Electoral College. They can try. But seriously, I mean, that's what George Washington was talking about. Indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest. And that's what's happening as well. They're trying to divide us against each other. It's always an issue of division. We're getting real practical today because George Washington talked about all these things that we're still dealing with: faction, despotism, division, all of those things. I mean, faction and division, that kind of means the same thing. But just it's easier to understand the word division because everything is about dividing us into groups right now. And it drives me crazy because we are one people in America. We are Americans, and which he's going to talk about next. Frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts. For this, you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens by birth or by choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. We are Americans. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case anymore. There are many who are a-religious. We have lots of different religions, which is fine. We have the right to practice them here. Manners, we definitely have different manners. Habits and political principles. Those unfortunately have not been taught to us all the same at all of our schools. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. Oh, could we be that again? I think we could. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. But these considerations, however powerfully they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Here, every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for carefully guarding and preserving the union of the whole. The North, in an unrestrained intercourse with the South, protected by the equal laws of a common government, finds in the productions of the latter a great additional resources of maritime and commercial enterprise and precious materials of the manufacturing industry. The South, in the same intercourse, benefiting from the agency of the North, sees its agriculture grow and its commerce expand. Turning partly into its own channels, the seamen of the North, it finds its particular navigation invigorated, while it contributes in different ways to nourish and increase the general mass of the national navigation. It looks forward to the protection of a maritime strength, to which itself is unequally adapted. The East, in a like intercourse with the West, already finds, and in the progressive improvement of interior communications by land and water, will more and more find a valuable vent for the commodities which it brings from abroad or manufactures at home. The West derives from the East supplies requisite for its growth and comfort, and what is perhaps of still greater consequence, it must of necessity owe the secure enjoyment of indispensable outlets for its own productions to the weight, influence, and future maritime strength of the Atlantic side of the Union, directed by an insoluble community of interest as one nation. Any other tenure by which the West can hold this essential advantage, whether derived from its own separate strength or from an apostate and unnatural connection with any foreign power, must be intrinsically precarious. While then, every part of our country thus feels an immediate and particular interest in union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find in the united mass of means and efforts greater strength, greater resource, proportionately greater security from external danger, a less frequent interruption of their peace by foreign nations, and, what is of inestimable value, they must derive from union and exemption from those broils and wars between themselves, which so frequently afflict neighboring countries not tied together by the same government, which their own rivalships alone would be sufficient to produce, but which opposite foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues would stimulate and embitter. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to republican liberty. In this sense, it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of the one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other. This is amazing. These considerations speak a persuasive language to every reflecting and virtuous mind. What did I say in the very first one? Only a virtuous people are capable of being free. These considerations speak a persuasive language to every reflecting and virtuous mind, and exhibit the countenance of the Union as a primary object of patriotic desire. Isn't that what we want? as patriots. We want to be unified in this country. There is so much to be unified over. Is there a doubt whether common government can embrace so large a sphere? Let's experience to solve it. To listen to mere speculation in such a case were criminal. We are authorized to hope that a proper organization of the whole, with the auxiliary agency of governments for respective subdivisions, will afford a happy issue for the experiment. 'Tis well worth a fair and full experiment with such powerful and obvious motives to union, affecting all parts of our country. While experience shall not have demonstrated its impracticability, there will always be reason to distrust the patriotism of those who in any quarter may endeavor to weaken its bands. Questioning the patriotism of those who try and weaken the bands of the Constitution and the Union. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. Isn't that what's happening today? You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. We are all Americans. The inhabitants of our Western country have lately had a useful lesson on this head. They have seen in the negotiation by the executive and in the unanimous ratification by the Senate of the treaty with Spain, and in the universal satisfaction at that event throughout the United States, a decisive proof how unfounded were the suspicions propagated among them of a policy in the general government and in the Atlantic states unfriendly to their interests in regard to the Mississippi. They have been witnesses to the formation of the two treaties, that with Great Britain and that with Spain, which secure to them everything they could desire in respect to our foreign relations, towards confirming their prosperity. It will not be their wisdom to rely for the preservation of these advantages on the union by which... Will it not be their wisdom to rely on the preservation of these advantages on the union by which they were procured? Will they not henceforth be deaf to those advisers, if such there are, who would sever them from their brethren and connect them with foreign aliens? To the efficacy and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliances, however strict between the parts, can be an adequate substitute. They must inevitably experience the infractions and interruptions which all alliances in times have experienced. Sensible of this momentous truth, you have improved upon your first essay by the adoption of a constitution of government, better calculated than your former for an intimate union, and for the management of your common concerns. This government, the offspring of our own choice, uninfluenced and unawed, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles and in the distribution of its powers. Executive orders, too many. The legislature needs to be legislating instead of letting the president's pen do all the work. That goes for every president, not just the current one. The legislature needs to do its job. Where was I? This government, the offspring of our own choice, uninfluenced and unawed, adopted upon full investigation with mature deliberation, completely free in its principles and in the distribution of its powers, uniting security and energy and containing within itself a provision for its own amendment, has a just claim to your confidence and your support. Respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures are duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. The basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and alter their constitutions of government. But the constitution which at any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. All obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associates under whatever plausible character with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constitutional authorities are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction or division. So when I say faction, that's what I mean. We talked about that before. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put it in the place of the delegated will of the nation, of the will of party. Often a small but artful, enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. Isn't that how we ought to govern? By mutual interest? What is the best for the majority? Not just what is my pet project, what is my personal view on XYZ that only applies to me and my group of people. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines that have lifted them into unjust dominion. I'm going to read that again. That's important. However, combinations or associations of the above description, what were they talking about? Artful, enterprising parties, right? However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer to popular ends, they are likely in the course and time of things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them into unjust dominion. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discountenance irregular oppositions to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretexts. One method of assault may be to effect, in the forms of the Constitution, alterations, which will impair the energy of the system, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. What does that sound like? Bureaucracy much? Can we overthrow that? Not very easily. It's going to take a lot of hard work. In all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of governments as of other human institutions, that experience is the surest standard by which to test the real tendency of the existing constitution of a country, that facility in changes upon the credit of mere hypothesis and opinion exposes to perpetual change from the endless variety of hypothesis and opinion. Isn't that the case? Endless variety. And remember especially that for the efficient management of your common interests in a country so extensive as ours, a government of as much vigor as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. Liberty itself will find in such a government, with powers properly distributed and adjusted, its surest guardian. It is indeed little else than a name where the government is too feeble to withstand the enterprises of faction, to confine each member of the society within the limits prescribed by the laws, and to maintain in all the secure and tranquil enjoyment of the rights of person and property. You know, at Davos, that's one of their things I talked about last week. They want to get rid of all of the property. Ridiculous. You know what they call it? What do they call it? Stakeholder capitalism. Isn't that just a ridiculous term? It's like, let's just talk about communism in a way that's really, really palatable for the people of the world. Lord have mercy. Keep America, America. I have already intimated to you the danger of the parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. Generally, this spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature. I love George Washington. The spirit of party, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rank. It's seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. Truth. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline in the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. This is so important for us to know, to read these things. It's so important because it's still what's happening today. What is happening? An individual, sooner or later, chief of some prevailing faction, doesn't matter what side, same thing, same, more and more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. I want you to think about that. Who is destroying public liberty right now? Who? I got censored. Thank goodness I am not censored anymore. I expect it'll happen again. With us, I won't stop talking about patriotism and George Washington or praying or reading the Bible. I'm not going to stop. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract at the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. It kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. This is what's happening. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true, and in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain that there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose, and there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate it. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent it bursting into flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. It is important likewise that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments into one. What does that sound like? Doesn't that sound like what's currently happening with the executive branch in our government in 2021? It is important. I'm going to read that again. It is important likewise that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments into one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of this position. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political power by dividing and distributing it into different depositories and constituting each the guardian of the public weal against invasions by the others has been evinced by experiments ancient and modern, some of them in our country and under our own eyes. To preserve them must be as necessary as to institute them. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment, the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, for it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. What? Usurpation. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. I am going to stop there for today because this letter goes on a little longer and I really would like to read the whole thing. So I am going to pause for now and we'll come back to you next week with the rest of this letter by George Washington. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Be blessed and stay free.
Thanks for watching The Practical Patriot. Like and subscribe below.
That's right.